All right, diving in today, we're going to untangle a knot that's been bugging me for a while. You know how in education, we're always tossing around terms like metacognition, self-regulation, and self-regulated learning.
Yeah, they get thrown around a lot.
It's like they're all kind of swirling together.
Yeah.
Are they really just different flavors of the same ice cream, or is there something more to it?
It's a good question. And in educational psychology, it's one that keeps popping up. They are definitely intertwined, these concepts, but teasing apart the nuances, that's where it gets interesting.
Right. So that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. We've been wading through a sea of research, specifically studies from 2003 to 2007.
And we've got a mountain of articles, 255 to be precise.
Wow, 255. That's a lot of reading.
It was. We dug into the PsycInfo database and then went even further, hand-searching some big journals in the field. Contemporary educational psychology, educational psychologists, you name it.
Okay, so a serious effort here. And for everyone listening, here's the takeaway we're aiming for. Walk away with a crystal clear understanding of these crucial concepts. Let's cut through the jargon and really get a handle on what makes learning tick.
Exactly. Because when you grasp the unique flavors of each of these ideas, you get this awesome panoramic view of what influences how we learn, how learners can really step up their game.
Okay, so to map this out, let's start at the source. Where did these ideas spring from in the first place?
Well, metacognition, that really took root in the 70s, thanks to John Flavel. He was all about metamemory, thinking about how we remember things.
Ah, the classic thinking about thinking.
Exactly. That's Flavel's big contribution. He laid out these 4 key pieces of the metacognition puzzle. First, metacognitive knowledge, like what you know about your own thinking processes. Then there's the metacognitive experience, the feelings and judgments that come with a mental task.
So, like, when you're struggling with a math problem and you get that sinking feeling like, uh-oh, this isn't going well.
Yeah, exactly. Then you've got your goals, what you're aiming for when you tackle a task, and finally, the strategies you use to get there. And the magic happens when these 4 elements interact. That's what drives the development of our metacognitive abilities, according to Flavel.
So it's all about looking inward at what's happening inside the learner's mind.
It is very much an inside-out perspective. And it fits snugly into a theory called endogenous constructivism. Basically, this idea says learners don't just soak up info from the outside world, they actively build their own understanding from within, like a plant growing from a seed, right? The emphasis is on the learner's internal development.
Fascinating. Now, we can't talk about metacognition without mentioning Baker and Brown. How did their work add to what Flavel started?
They really expanded on his framework in 1984. They said, look, there are 2 main sides to this metacognition coin. First, you've got knowledge about cognition, which is basically Flavel's monitoring idea. But then they added this whole layer of self-regulatory mechanisms.
Oh, interesting. So we're moving beyond just being aware of our thinking and into actually taking the reins.
Exactly. It's about actively managing those cognitive processes. Things like checking how well you're doing, planning your approach to a problem, even testing and revising your strategies along the way. And then, of course, evaluating the whole process afterward.
And that's where the connection to self-regulation starts to become crystal clear.
Absolutely. Baker and Brown's work was a turning point, a bridge between just knowing about your thinking and actively steering it. And this really paved the way for the emergence of self-regulated learning as its own thing, even though it's still closely related.
Got it. So that's the cognitive side of the equation. But self-regulation itself, where does that come from? What's the origin story there?
It's a bit different. We have to look to Albert Bandura and his social learning theory back in the 70s. It's had a huge impact on how we view self-regulation.
So less about thinking and more about controlling your actions and emotions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Initially, the emphasis was on regulating your behavior and emotions, like keeping those impulses in check. But later on, motivation got added to the mix, especially through this concept of self-efficacy.
Self-efficacy, that's basically believing in your own ability to succeed.
Right. And it's a powerful motivator. Now, Bandura also introduced this crucial idea of reciprocal determinism. It's all about how the person, their behavior, and the environment, they're constantly influencing each other. Think of it like a 3-way dance, where each partner is leading and following at the same time.
So it's not just what's going on inside our heads, it's how we interact with the world around us.
Precisely. And within this framework, self-regulation highlights how the environment can shape us through our own actions. And these influences are often shaped by self-processes like self-reinforcement, like, giving yourself a pat on the back for a job well done.
Okay, so metacognition is more internal, focused on reflection, while self-regulation brings in the environment and our actions. Now, where does self-regulated learning fit into this picture? How did that concept come to be?
Self-regulated learning, or SRL as it's often called, emerged in the 80s and really took off in the 90s. And it was a deliberate attempt to bring together both metacognition and self-regulation. Think of it as a merger, combining the best of both worlds to understand how we learn in a more complete way.
So it's like SRL is the child of metacognition and self-regulation.
That's a great way to put it. SRL wants to understand how cognitive strategies, motivation, and the learning environment all work together. It's not interested in studying them in isolation. It wants to see the whole picture, the whole symphony.
And what's the overarching theory behind SRL?
Dialectical constructivism. It suggests that it's not an either situation between internal cognitive development and external learning from the environment. They both matter, and they influence each other constantly. Like a dance, remember, two partners both leading and following.
Okay, so we've got metacognition, thinking about thinking, internal focus, self-regulation, managing behavior and emotions, interacting with the world, and self-regulated learning. Bringing those two together, especially in academics, and emphasizing that back and forth between the learner and the environment. Awesome foundation. Now, let's dive into the actual research you analyzed. How did you approach those 255 studies?
It was a systematic process. First, we did a focused search in the PsycInfo database using those three key terms: metacognition, self-regulation, and self-regulated learning.
So you started with the digital haystack.
Exactly. We narrowed it down to empirical studies, the ones with actual data, and specifically from 2003 to 2007. We wanted to capture the most recent trends. But we didn't stop there.
You went old school, right?
We did. We manually combed through journals like Contemporary Education Psychology, Educational Psychologist, Instructional Science, the Journal of Educational Psychology, and even Metacognition and Learning, which was a relatively new kid on the block back then.
So you really went the extra mile to make sure you weren't missing anything.
Absolutely. And we focused on studies that dealt with learning in academic settings. We wanted to make sure we were comparing apples to apples. And after all that, we ended up with our 255 studies.
Okay, so a massive data set. How did you even begin to make sense of all of it?
We created a coding system. For each article, we looked at how they defined the key concepts, how they measured them, what specific methods they used, like questionnaires or observations, and whether they used any kind of prompting or scaffolding to support the learners.
Sounds incredibly detailed. But you mentioned earlier that it wasn't always smooth sailing. What were some of the roadblocks you encountered?
Oh, there were a few. For starters, sometimes a study would be tagged with a keyword like self-regulated learning. But when you dug in, it wasn't actually the main focus. Like, they might mention it briefly, but the research itself was looking at something else entirely.
So the keyword was more of a general label than a true reflection of what the study was about.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes a study would be categorized under one term, but really be about something else. Like, we found studies on self-regulated strategy development, SRSD, that were listed under self-regulated learning. But SRT is more about teaching specific strategies, not measuring SRL as a whole.
So you had to look beyond the label and into the heart of the research.
We did. And then there were studies that looked at more than one concept at the same time. This was really common with self-regulation and self-regulated learning, but we saw with the other pairings too. Like, a study might look at both metacognition and self-regulation, or metacognition in SRL.
So how did you decide where to put those studies?
We looked at how they defined the concepts and what measures they used. Like, if a study mentioned both self-regulation and SRL, but mostly used the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire, MSLQ, which is a classic SRL tool, we'd categorize it under SRL. It wasn't always black and white, but we did our best to place each study where it fit best.
Okay, that makes sense. So a lot of detective work went into organizing this data. Now let's talk about what you actually found. What are some of the big trends that emerged from all those studies? Let's start with how they define these key terms.
Well, one of the first things we looked at was how clearly they defined the concepts they were studying. We categorized definitions as either explicit, where they straight up said what they meant, or implicit, where you had to kind of piece it together from the rest of the study.
So like a detective novel versus a puzzle.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Overall, it was almost an even split. About 49% had explicit definitions and 51% were implicit. But there were some interesting differences between the three concepts.
Ah, tell me more.
Explicit definitions were way more common in the self-regulation and self-regulated learning research, like 57% for self-regulation and 69% for SRL. But for metacognition, it was only 32%.
Why do you think that is? Is it because metacognition is just seen as more self-explanatory?
That's possible. Maybe researchers assume everyone's on the same page with the whole thinking about thinking idea.
Makes sense. What about those implicit definitions? How were researchers hinting at the meaning without directly saying it?
There were three main ways. Sometimes they'd use words or phrases that strongly suggested the meaning, kind of like dropping hints.
Subtle clues?
Exactly. Other times, they'd cite important works in the field, letting those references speak for themselves. And then, sometimes they'd just let the measures they used implicitly define the concept. But we didn't see many cases where a definition was only based on references. It was more common to combine those with some conceptual hints in the text.
So like a treasure hunt with multiple clues leading to the same spot.
Yeah, that's a good way to picture it. And another interesting thing, self-regulation and SRL were way more likely to be defined just by the measures used. Like 38% for self-regulation and 30% for SRL, compared to only 15% for metacognition. It's like the measure itself became the definition in some cases.
So a real range of approaches there. You also looked at the specific words that popped up in the explicit definitions.
We did. And there were 7 key words that showed up pretty consistently across all 3 concepts: monitor, control, regulate, cognition, motivation, behavior, and knowledge.
Those all seem pretty central to these ideas. Any differences in how often they appeared in the definitions?
Definitely. Self-regulation and SRL definitions were broader, often including words like cognition, motivation, and behavior. Metacognition definitions were more focused on the cognitive stuff, not so much on motivation or behavior.
So reflecting those different theoretical roots we talked about earlier, did those keywords give any hints about potential overlap between the concepts?
Oh, absolutely. The overlap between self-regulation and SRL was especially striking. They both use terms like behavior, motivation, cognition, monitoring, and control. It really suggests a strong connection there, maybe even a hierarchy, with SRL as a specific type of self-regulation that happens in academic settings.
Right, like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares.
Exactly. And then both monitor and control were common across all 3 concepts, which makes sense, right? They're all about being aware of something and then trying to manage it.
Awareness and management, two sides of the same coin. Now let's talk about how those definitions lined up with the ways researchers actually measured these concepts. What did you find there?
This was one of the most interesting parts of our analysis. The level of alignment between what researchers said they were studying and how they actually measured it. It varied quite a bit.
So sometimes there was a disconnect between theory and practice.
Yeah, sometimes. But SRL studies actually had a much higher rate of alignment than metacognition and self-regulation studies. Like 92% of SRL studies had a clear match between definition and measurement, compared to 71% for metacognition and 63% for self-regulation.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference.
It is. But even when things seemed aligned, we often ran into problems with how clearly the measures were described. Sometimes, especially with researcher-developed measures, the descriptions were super vague. Like they'd give you the name of the measure and maybe a couple of sample items, but that was it.
Not very helpful for understanding what they were actually measuring.
Exactly. And this problem was even worse when the definitions themselves were implicit. It was like trying to compare 2 blurry pictures and see if they matched.
A real challenge. What about studies that involved teaching something, like a specific metacognitive strategy?
Those were tricky too. They might define the strategy clearly, but then measure something like overall task performance instead of how well students were using the strategy. It made it hard to see the direct connection between what they were teaching and what they were measuring.
Like, you teach a kid how to swing a baseball bat, but then you just measure how fast they can run.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really tell you if they're using the technique you taught them.
Hmm.
So what types of measures were researchers using the most?
Right. What were the go-to tools in these studies?
Self-report measures were the most common, by far. Like, they made up 43% of all the measures we looked at. And for self-regulation and SRL, they were even more dominant.
So researchers are relying heavily on students to report on their own thoughts, feelings, and actions.
Yeah, that's the trend. But it's important to distinguish between those broad self-report questionnaires and things like judgments of learning or feelings of knowing. Those are still self-reports, but they're tied to a specific task. Like you ask a student how confident they are in their answer right after they give it.
So there's a direct connection to actual performance in those cases.
Exactly. It gives you a different kind of evidence than just asking someone about their general study habits. But our concern is that relying so heavily on self-report, especially the general kind, might not be enough to capture the complexity of self-regulation and SRL. You need other types of data to get the full picture.
Makes sense. What about the learning environment itself? Did the studies consider things like prompting or scaffolding?
Yes, they did. And we saw a lot of prompting and scaffolding in the SRL studies, and to a lesser extent in the metacognition studies. Not so much in the self-regulation studies, though.
Why do you think that is?
It might be because self-regulation research often uses less structured tasks. Metacognition and SRL studies tend to involve more specific cognitive tasks or learning activities, where scaffolding can be really helpful.
So the type of research influences the need for support.
It seems that way. And for metacognition and SRL, we saw a pretty even split between computer-based and human-provided scaffolding, which is interesting because you'd think with all the research on SRL in tech-rich environments, there'd be more computer scaffolding.
Yeah, you'd expect technology to be playing a bigger role there.
Right. And another thing we noticed, a lot of those scaffolding studies didn't gradually fade the support over time or use delayed post-tests.
So it's hard to know if the scaffolding actually helps students become more self-regulated in the long run.
Exactly. If they're always relying on external prompts, they might not develop those internal self-regulation skills. It's like training wheels on a bike. You have to take them off eventually.
Okay, so we've talked about definitions, measurement, the learning environment. As we wrap up, what are your big takeaways from all of this? What are the final frames, as you called them?
Well, despite coming from different places, metacognition, self-regulation, and self-regulated learning, they all share a core idea. It's all about monitoring your own thoughts and actions and then trying to control them to steer them in the right direction.
Awareness and management, again.
Exactly. But just because they share that core doesn't mean they're the same thing. Researchers need to be really careful about how they define and differentiate these concepts.
So using the right term for the right situation, where do you see the biggest points of convergence and divergence between them?
It's been fascinating to see how they've kind of danced around each other over time. Initially, metacognition was all about the cognitive stuff, while self-regulation was more about how we interact with the world. But over the years, those lines have blurred. Metacognition research has started looking at behavior more, and self-regulation research has started paying more attention to cognitive processes.
So they're coming closer together in some ways.
They are, but the role of the environment is still a big differentiator. For a lot of self-regulation researchers, the environment triggers self-awareness and regulation, but metacognition researchers tend to focus more on internal cues.
Like you trip over a rock and that makes you aware of your surroundings, versus you feel a rumbling in your stomach and that makes you aware of your hunger.
Exactly. And SRL, being focused on academic learning, is kind of trying to bridge those two perspectives. But even within SRL, there seem to be two main camps. One that aligns more with general self-regulation in school, and another that's all about how learners interact with technology.
Two sides of the same coin, again.
Right. You also mentioned the challenges of measuring these things effectively.
Yeah, the measurement conundrum. You brought up some serious concerns about the over-reliance on self-report measures.
It's a valid concern. Those broad questionnaires might not be sensitive enough to capture the subtle, context-dependent nature of monitoring and regulation. We need more precise tools, and we need to find ways to confirm what students tell us with more objective evidence. Things like learning analytics and mixed methods approaches, combining numbers and stories, hold a lot of promise.
So, more tools in the toolbox. And finally, you talked about the lack of developmental and longitudinal studies.
Yeah, that was a bit surprising. Metacognition has its roots in developmental research, but we need more studies that track the development of self-regulation and SRL over time. How do those abilities change as we age? How does external support become internalized? What influences the transfer of these skills to new situations? These are big questions that need more attention.
A lot of fertile ground for future research.
Absolutely. And as the field moves forward, it's crucial to be clear and rigorous in how we define, measure, and apply these concepts.
So for our listeners, here's the bottom line. Metacognition, self-regulation, and self-regulated learning, they're all about monitoring and control, but they come from different places, emphasize different things, and still pose challenges for researchers.
And the more we understand these differences, the better equipped we'll be to support and enhance learning.
Exactly. So here's a thought for you to ponder. Think about your own learning journey. What resonates most with you? Are you super aware of your own thinking process? Do you focus more on managing your actions and your environment? Or are you most conscious of the specific strategies and motivations you use in different situations? How can a deeper understanding of these different aspects of learning help you become a more effective learner? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep those wheels turning.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.